I want to welcome and say how pleased I am to be with Diann Rust-Tierney, who's the Executive Director of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. That's a position she's held since 2004. Before that, she was the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Capital Punishment Project and the Legislative Counsel, Chief Legislative Counsel for the ACLU's Washington branch. Her voice has long been one of power and principle with respect to discussions about capital punishment and what it means as a legal, policy, moral, ethical issue. So with that, by way of very brief introduction, Diann, could you tell us something about the National Coalition, its mission, and where things stand with respect to your success in moving toward that mission?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say how delighted I am to be talking to you. I really admire all the work that you've been doing and what you're doing now to kind of build a legacy so that people learn from this struggle. And so going forward, when we have these future challenges around civil and human rights, people can see all the good things we've done. They can see some of the mistakes that we've made, but all of this will be about moving everything forward. So I just want to say how delighted I am to be here with you and be a part of this. The National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty is more than 40 years old. And when it was first founded by people like Hugo Badeau and Henry Schwarzschild, my predecessor at the ACLU, they often said that at the time, they just wanted to be a voice crying out in the wilderness. When the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty was founded, it was in response to the Supreme Court's decision that made it lawful to begin executions in the United States. And at that time, there was enormous public support for the death penalty, or at least no questioning of it. And they said that if we could just, pull together people of goodwill, of civil rights leaders, religious leaders, that we should be able to at least be a voice of reason, bringing as many good arguments as we can to the floor about this issue. And so from that legacy, we find ourselves here today. One of the things that they did that was very, very wise was to identify the importance of not only bringing national organizations together, like the American Civil Liberties Union, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, many of the religious organizations. They also saw the importance of building capacity in the states of organizations that were independent of the national organization, but affiliated, that would fight the battle on a state-by-state basis. Because at the time, and it's still is true today, the major struggle around the death penalty is at the state level, where these executions had been taking place. And so this vision of getting people from around the country to come together to talk about the death penalty, to educate the death penalty, and to ultimately educate their friends and neighbors and their lawmakers was part of that big vision. And so one of the things that I tried to do when I came to the National Coalition was to kind of carry that forward and to continue to build the capacity of the state affiliates, to work with others to develop a national strategy against the death penalty, and then to use that infrastructure that had been built, those wonderful people who were so committed to begin to change. And so that's what we've seen happen. We've seen state by state, these small organizations build the capacity, bring in allies to actually change the law with regard to the death penalty.
Well, these are very dynamic and interesting times. As we're talking now, there are serious discussions going on in Virginia and at the federal level, and no doubt in many other jurisdictions. What's your sense about the short and long-term kind of trajectory of the death penalty throughout this country?
I think it's ending, and we've seen that. It's become more and more rare. It's become more and more unpopular. And we now, for the first time, have a serious effort at the federal level to end the death penalty, the federal death penalty. And that's something we haven't seen. The federal government has lagged for decades behind the progress we've seen in the states around this issue. And so now I think we're at a critical point where we might actually see some serious discussion at the federal level, and ultimately, not right away, we have some work to do to lay the groundwork, to educate the public, to build the political support. But I do think that we're going to see the end of the death penalty at the federal level, and we're going to continue to see the death penalty reduced and ultimately eliminated at the state level.
Well, when discussing the death penalty, it's impossible to separate capital punishment from its history with and continuing concerns with respect to race. And can you elaborate on some of the history concerning race, capital punishment, and its continuing influence today?
Absolutely. You know, I have to say my thinking about race and the death penalty has evolved. And I think it's actually during this time of the pandemic when we've seen the response to the killing of George Floyd and so many other people, and sort of the nationwide and worldwide protests around the abuse that people of color and African Americans in particular see at the hands of police and law enforcement. As I've read books like Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and I've thought again about Michelle Alexander's work on this issue, you know, I've evolved from thinking that the racial disparities in the way that we see the death penalty applied, that it's more than an unfortunate side effect. It is the point that if you look historically at how the death penalty has been used, it has always been used to say quite clearly which lives are worth more than others. You have seen from the time of slavery all through Jim Crow, where the same crimes did not carry the same punishment, where whether you get the death penalty or not depends on who you are and who your victim is. And so that is why we see that the death penalty is used disproportionately when victims are white, and in particular that people of color are disproportionately sentenced to death. And so one of the reasons that I am optimistic about us ending the death penalty ultimately is because I see that our country is on this path to really, for the first time, reckon with sort of the unfinished business of frankly, the Civil War. And we actually don't have a choice. You know, we're confronting right now a very clear discussion about whether we're going to be a country that embraces and tolerates an ideology of white nationalism and white supremacy, or whether we're going to be a country that is actually going to try this incredible experiment of being a diverse, representative democracy. And so I think in that context, there is going to be new energy and a new interest in looking at all these relics, all these things that are symbols and all these things that are structural underpinnings of a system that's fundamentally inconsistent with the kind of representative democracy we're going to want to see. So for me, it's important to call out the racial discrimination in the death penalty, but it's also important to recognize that the death penalty, and I guess this is the sort of the big point for me, that the death penalty doesn't have and never has had anything to do with law enforcement. It doesn't work. You can't find it as a deterrent. It's not targeted at the most serious crimes. It's not targeted at the people who are most likely to be victimized because it wasn't supposed to. And so I think when you understand the death penalty in that context, and you put it in the larger context of what we need to do to move forward as a representative democracy and diverse representative democracy, it's an entirely different conversation, but the one that we've been trapped in before, which is like, well, if we don't have the death penalty, what are we going to do with people? Well, we're going to do with people what we've always done, which is to hold them accountable. But I think when you understand the true meaning of the death penalty and how it's been used, we're in a whole different conversation. And I think that's a conversation that's much more likely and more quickly going to lead us to ending the death penalty. And I think creating what we all aspire to, which is this more perfect union.
You make the point very eloquently that in part, the criminal justice system is not insulated from larger society. And in fact, frequently within the criminal justice system, we see some of the larger societal trends magnified, amplified. Can you just briefly touch on some of the specific decision points in the context of a capital case where race might come into play?
Right. Well, it starts at the very beginning, and I think that's why you can't separate, the death penalty from the conversation we started having around the murder of George Floyd. Um, that your first interaction in the criminal system is often your interaction with the police. And that can go one of two ways. A police officer may see something and decide that, well, that's just nothing, and or decide, I'm going to pursue this further and I'm going to escalate. And so the first point is the entry point into the system. And then once you get into the system, and also that goes into how cases are even investigated. So how does a person actually get into the system to even be tried with a crime at some point? Well, oftentimes, if there's not a suspect in the crime, they'll go back to their playbook of like, well, who's already in the system? And let's see if there are any suspects there. So, well, if you have a system that tends to over criminalize Black and brown people, that's going to be your pool. And I think that's one of the reasons that we see that disproportionately people of color are more at risk for being wrongfully convicted and wrongfully sentenced to death. So that's one piece. Then you get into the prosecutor, who's the decision maker. And so the prosecutor at that time can decide whether or not I'm going to treat this case like virtually all other cases and seek a prison sentence, or whether I'm going to seek this as a capital case. And again, that's a very subjective decision. That's a very oftentimes political decision. And those things are also influenced by race. It's also influenced by the fact that prosecutors still tend to be overwhelmingly white men. And so again, that's another opportunity. Then you get into, so again, you have a sort of a rarefied pool going into even going into trial. Then when you get to the trial, we still see practices where people are facing execution, where every or virtually all people of color have been removed from the trial, so they're going to trial before all white juries, or where the system, the way it works, acts to exclude certain people who tend to be against the death penalty. These are not people who can't follow the law and impose a lawful sentence, but people who express some kind of qualm, some kind of concern about a process that legitimately should raise concern, are often excluded based on that. And that tends to exclude people of color, that tends to exclude women, that tends to disproportionately exclude people of a certain religious faiths. And so all along, we sort of can't expect a better result in our capital cases than we actually see every day in the criminal justice system. That's why we have so many problems with overcriminalization of Black and brown people. And then just to put it another way, when the Supreme Court was asked to look at the racial disparities in the Supreme Court in the McCluskey case, one of the rationales that they gave for not granting relief was that, well, if we give relief here, we'll have to give relief in all these cases. And so that's sort of the backside of it. We have a problem of fairness in our criminal justice system. So why would we think that we could have a system that decides who lives and who dies in that same system without having a problem?
Well, these issues are complicated. They are vexing. And it's wonderful that you and your organization are pursuing them. Very best wishes in that mission. Diann, I really want to thank you. I know you've been a tireless worker on these issues, and also with respect to the National Death Penalty Archive. At the archive, we have the organizational records of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty from, I think, 1981 to 2006. As the history with the death penalty continues to get written, you'll be part of those writing it, and we hope that the archive will be there to record it. So Diann Rust-Tierney, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us.
Thank you for your work. Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you.